Imagine it's Canada, 2026, and your morning starts with a tiny moment of hesitation that shouldn't exist in a wealthy G7 country. You reach for the coffee, but your brain does the math first. The bag you bought last year feels like it's been quietly replaced by a luxury item. The price isn't up by a few cents. It's up enough that you notice it. You notice it the way you notice rent, the way you notice interest rates, the way you notice a country getting more expensive without getting better. You scroll your phone and there it is, your mobile bill. You're paying 2 or 3 times more for data than people in places like France. And for what? A connection that still dies in the exact same spots, the same subway dead zones, the same buffering. It's the same one bar that feels more like a joke than a signal. Then you walk into the grocery store to buy something basic, something adult, something normal like a steak for dinner. You pick it up, you put it back, because the price is no longer the price of food. It's the price of a system. And that's when you begin to understand the most Canadian paradox of all. You live in a country that markets itself as fair, stable, and free, while operating like a set of protected corridors where competition goes to die. The shelves look like variety, bright brands, endless choices, a buffet of capitalism. But if you peel back the packaging, you realize you're not walking through a marketplace. You're walking through a hall of mirrors, 20 logos, 10 different stores, 5 different deals, and behind most of them, the same boardrooms, the same families, the same handful of executives who don't need to win your loyalty because they already own your alternatives. Economists have a polite word for this: oligopoly. It sounds academic. It sounds like something that belongs in a textbook. But in real life, oligopoly means you don't have choices, you have lanes. You can switch lanes, but you can't leave the highway. And the most important part, the part people whisper but rarely say out loud, is that in Canada, these lanes are often protected, not by brute force, not by secret meetings in smoke-filled rooms, protected by policy, protected by licensing, protected by national champions, protected by regulations that sound like they're defending the public, while quietly defending the incumbents. So today, we're not doing a rant. We're doing an autopsy. Because if you've ever felt like Canada is slightly overpriced compared to the rest of the developed world, you're not paranoid. You're not imagining it. You're just a captive customer. And I'm going to show you how the map is divided, how the walls were built, and why the people running this system don't need to conspire in the cartoon villain sense. Because when the market structure is tight enough, the structure itself does the conspiring for them. We're going to break down the pillars one by one. The grocery barons who turned food into a controlled corridor. The telecom triopoly that turned data into a luxury. The banking cartel that profits while households drown. The skylords who make domestic travel feel like international business class. And the industry that Canada doesn't just tolerate, but defends with a firewall of tariffs and law. But we start where you feel it most, in your stomach. The grocery barons, where choice becomes theater. Walk into a Canadian grocery store and you'll feel like you're doing what you're supposed to do. You're being a rational consumer, comparing prices, picking the best deal, being responsible. Maybe you go to a big box superstore. Maybe you go to something premium. Maybe you go to a discount brand because you're trying to survive the month, and you feel like you've made a choice. But then you start noticing something strange. The store names change, but the ownership doesn't. You step into one banner, then another, and the money keeps landing in the same place. Because Canada's grocery system isn't a free market in the way people imagine it. It's a concentrated empire where a handful of companies control most of what the country eats. On paper, it looks like 5 major players. In reality, it behaves like 3 or 4 giants dividing territory, each with a portfolio of brands designed to catch you, no matter what your income level is. Here's the psychological trick. They don't just own the premium stores, they also own the discount stores. So when you try to punish them by shopping cheaper, you're often still feeding them, just a different pocket. And when a market becomes that concentrated, competition doesn't disappear in one dramatic moment. It fades, quietly. It fades the way a room gets colder when the heat is turned down 1 degree at a time. Then comes the part that stops being theory. Because Canada doesn't just have high grocery prices. Canada has something darker. Proof that coordination isn't just possible, it happened. The bread scandal wasn't a rumor. It wasn't a Twitter thread. It was the kind of story that makes you stare at the wall for a minute, because it reveals what food becomes when power is concentrated. For years, major grocers and suppliers were accused of coordinating to push up the price of packaged bread. Bread, the thing people buy when they have nothing else. The symbol of basic. The last purchase before hunger becomes real. And when that story surfaced, the penalty felt like theater. A small gift card, a PR apology, a corporate shrug. Because in a truly competitive market, your punishment is losing customers. But in a captive market, your punishment is a headline. And you don't fear headlines when you control the distribution, the real estate, the supply chain, the shelf placement, and the alternatives. Then the pandemic arrived, the great stress test of modern capitalism. Supply chains did break. Costs did rise. Inflation did surge. But here's the question that Canada forced people to ask. If everything is getting hard, why do a few companies still look like they're having the best years of their lives? Why do grocery profits hit records while food banks hit records? And why, in the early pandemic months, did hero pay show up like a brief moral awakening, only to disappear almost in synchronized timing as if the system had snapped back into its natural shape? This is the pattern you're going to see again and again. A protected market doesn't need to be evil, it just needs to be comfortable. It's comfortable enough that nobody has to fight for you. Comfortable enough that the customer becomes a number. Comfortable enough that prices can rise not because value rises, but because resistance is weak. And that's why the grocery oligopoly is the most visceral monopoly in the country. You don't feel it in charts. You feel it holding a basic item in your hand, reading a price that makes you briefly angry, then briefly tired, then quietly resigned. And that resignation is the real profit engine. Because once you accept that this is just how Canada is, the system wins permanently. But food is only the first corridor. Because when you get home, when you finally sit down, you try to distract yourself from the grocery bill. You reach for your phone, and the next protected empire is already waiting in your pocket. The telecom triopoly, the data lords in your pocket. Now let's move from the grocery aisle to the device that's basically become your second nervous system. Pull out your phone and look at the tiny name in the corner. That little label decides how much you pay to exist in modern society. Because unless you're one of the rare people on a regional carrier, there's a very high chance your money is flowing to one of three empires: Bell, Rogers, TELUS. And here's the part that makes Canadians feel insane. The prices are so high that you start rationalizing them like weather. Canada is big. Canada is cold. It's expensive to build towers, and sure, Canada is big. But the size argument only works until you compare it to other large, sparsely populated countries that still manage to give people cheaper plans and better value. The truth isn't geography. The truth is market structure. In Canada, the big three don't just dominate the network. They dominate the illusion of competition. Let's play the game they want you to play. You're not with Bell, you're with Virgin Plus, except Virgin is Bell. You're not with Rogers, you're with Fido, except Fido is Rogers. You're not with TELUS, you're with Koodo, except Koodo is TELUS. This is what economists would call brand segmentation. What normal people call it is simpler. They built multiple doors into the same building. So when customers get angry, the system doesn't collapse. It redirects. You storm out of the front entrance and walk right back in through a side door with a friendlier logo and a discount that was always priced into the plan. That's why the telecom market feels like a closed loop. Because it is. These companies can posture as competitors while functioning like a shared organism. They don't need to explicitly collude. When the market is concentrated enough, the incentives line up naturally. And the reason it stays concentrated is not only business power, it's policy. Canada has long had foreign ownership restrictions in telecom, and the public justification always sounds noble. National security, cultural sovereignty, protecting Canadian infrastructure. But the outcome is painfully Canadian. Instead of being protected from exploitation, you're protected for exploitation. Not by foreigners, by domestic champions who behave like toll collectors. And yes, regulators exist. On paper. But here's the problem with regulating a protected triopoly. The regulator is often trapped between two fears. Fear number one, if we let competition in, we lose control. Fear number two, if we squeeze the incumbents too hard, they reduce investment and blame the government for worse service. So the watchdog becomes cautious. Then the cautious watchdog becomes predictable. And predictability is the oxygen of monopolies. Even when prices dip slightly during political pressure, cycles especially around big public outrage, moments the structure stays intact. Because if you can drop your price temporarily to avoid reform, you'll do it. That's cheaper than real competition. And while Canadians stress over bills, these companies often remain some of the most profitable corporate machines in the country, fueling dividends, buybacks, and shareholder rewards. So here's the economic model underneath your phone bill. The government limits foreign competition, gives the market concentrates, gives the firms build flanker brands, gives consumers switch without escaping, gives prices stay high without obvious collusion. That's the loop. And that loop doesn't just drain your wallet, it trains you psychologically. Because once you pay $70 a month for something other countries treat like a $20 utility, your definition of normal gets rewritten. And when your definition of normal gets rewritten, become easier to monetize everywhere else. Which brings us to the most elegant monopoly in Canada. Not the one that mugs you in public, the one that smiles at you in a suit. The banking cartel. The tuxedo pickpockets. If telecoms are the guys taking your wallet in an alley, banks are the guys shaking your hand while they do it. Canada's banking system is famously stable. It's also famously concentrated. A small handful of major banks dominate the entire financial bloodstream of the country. That's not just big business, that's structural leverage. Because the moment a sector becomes the plumbing of society, it stops being optional. And anything that stops being optional becomes a toll road. Here's the trade Canada made decades ago: stability over competition. And to be fair, Canada's banks didn't implode the way some American institutions did in 2008. A tighter regulatory culture and a different risk profile helped. But here's the part Canadians pay for in silence. You don't get stability for free. You pay a stability tax. And that tax shows up in 1,000 tiny cuts that feel like just how banking works until you compare it to countries with more diverse financial ecosystems. Monthly account fees for the privilege of holding your money. Overdraft fees that punish the poor for being poor. NSF fees that hit like a hammer when you're already down. Transaction fees, transfer fees. ATM fees, small enough not to riot over, large enough to add up into billions. And while households struggle under the weight of debt and cost of living pressure, the major banks can produce profits so large they start to sound fictional, which is the point. Because in a competitive market, customers force banks to compete on fees and service. But in a concentrated market, banks don't have to fight for you. They just have to keep you inside the system. Then comes the real chokehold: housing. In Canada, the mortgage is not just a loan, it's a leash. When interest rates rise, payments rise quickly. The pain transmits fast. And because a concentrated banking system dominates lending, the pain transmits through the same set of channels, meaning the entire country can feel like it's being squeezed by one hand. That's why these institutions become too big to fail in practice, even if nobody says the phrase out loud. And once you are too big to fail, you gain a quiet power that almost no politician wants to challenge. Because if something goes wrong, the blame is catastrophic. So governments protect the banks. And the banks learn that protection is part of their business model. Now layer on top the upsell culture that turned branches into sales floors. The idea that every interaction is a chance to extract more revenue. You walk in to deposit a check, you leave with a pitch. You call about a charge, you get sold a product. Employees are pressured to hit targets, not solve problems. The institution becomes less a service and more a machine. And in the background, the profits keep climbing. So by now, look at the pattern we've uncovered. Food you must buy. Data you must use. Banking you can't opt out of. Each sector has slightly different excuses: geography, stability, sovereignty, but the mechanism is the same. Limited competition plus high barriers to entry plus regulatory protection equals pricing power. That's the model. Now the story gets fun. Because what happens when you want to escape? What happens when you say, fine, I'll leave, I'll travel, I'll get out? That's when you meet the next gatekeeper. The people who control your ability to move through your own country. Skylords. The Skylords. When escape becomes a toll road, by the time you get fed up with grocery prices, phone bills, and bank fees, a natural instinct kicks in. You want to leave. Not permanently, not dramatically. Just a short break. Somewhere warmer, somewhere cheaper. Somewhere that doesn't feel like a monthly invoice disguised as a country. So you open a flight search, and that's when Canada's next protected corridor reveals itself. Welcome to the domain of the Skylords. For most Canadians, domestic air travel is controlled by two names that no longer feel like brands. They feel like infrastructure: Air Canada and WestJet. On paper, there are other airlines. In reality, the market behaves like a duopoly. Between them and their subsidiaries, these two carriers dominate the overwhelming majority of domestic capacity. Routes, hubs, gates, schedules, the geometry of air travel bends around them. And once again, you're told the story. Canada is big. Canada is cold. Canada is hard to fly. But here's the problem with that story. Europe isn't small. Australia isn't dense. And yet, consumers there routinely pay a fraction of what Canadians pay to fly comparable distances. The difference isn't geography, it's competition. In Canada, competition doesn't fail because people don't want cheaper flights. It fails because new entrants don't survive long enough to matter. You can trace the wreckage. Low-cost carriers that launched with promise slashed fares and excited consumers only to be absorbed, squeezed, or quietly buried. Routes get pulled, gates get reassigned, financing dries up. The sky closes again because the incumbents don't need to crush competitors aggressively. They just need to outlast them. They control the slots. They control the hubs. They control the bargaining power with airports. And airports in Canada are not neutral players. Here's the detail most people miss. Unlike many other developed countries, Canada treats airports as revenue-generating assets, not economic infrastructure. Airports pay rent to the federal government. That cost cascades downward into fees, surcharges, and improvements that you see itemized on your ticket. By the time you buy a domestic flight, a startling portion of what you're paying isn't airfare at all. It's a layered stack of charges that make movement itself feel taxable. You're not just paying to fly. You're paying to exist in a system where every node extracts its cut. And what do you get for those prices? Not excellence. In satisfaction rankings, Canadian Airlines consistently hover near the bottom. Service feels transactional. Delays feel normalized. Complaints feel futile. But the companies don't need to impress you. They just need to be the only ones going where you need to go. That's the pattern again. Not abuse. Indifference. And indifference is only possible when exit is hard. Food, data, money, movement. Every time you try to step sideways, the system funnels you back into another protected lane. And now we arrive at the monopoly Canada doesn't even pretend is a market. The one defended not by corporate lobbying alone, but by law itself. The one politicians fear touching. The one that makes milk cost what it costs. The milk mafia, supply management without apology. This is where the conversation gets dangerous. Because this isn't just a corporate concentration problem. This is a state-designed cartel. Supply management sounds boring, technical, sensible. But strip away the branding and what remains is simple. The government decides who is allowed to produce, how much they can produce, and at what price. In most countries, if you want to become a dairy farmer, you buy land, buy cows, and start producing milk. In Canada, that's illegal. Before you can sell a drop commercially, you must buy a government-issued license, granting you permission to produce a fixed amount of milk. That quota is not cheap. In many regions, quota values reach into the millions. It becomes the single most expensive asset on a dairy farm, often worth more than the land or equipment itself. This does three things immediately. It blocks new entrants. It caps supply regardless of demand. And it turns dairy farming into an asset-holding class rather than a competitive business. Once you own quota, you're protected. Once you don't, you're locked out. Prices are then administered, not discovered. A federal agency sets farm gate prices using a cost of production formula. Those prices flow downstream through processors and retailers directly into your grocery bill. And because competition is illegal, prices don't fall, they only rise. Studies estimate this system costs the average Canadian household hundreds of dollars per year. It's regressive. Families with children pay more. Low-income households feel it most. And yet, the system survives. Why? Politics. Quota holders are concentrated in electorally critical regions. They organize, they vote, they donate. And every major party has decided that touching supply management is too dangerous. So the system persists, not because it's efficient, but because it's politically insulated. Canada is willing to risk trade disputes, retaliation, and export sector pain to protect this one industry. And that tells you something profound. When a monopoly becomes sacred, it stops being economic policy. It becomes ideology. And at this point, the pattern should be unmistakable. Protected sectors, high barriers, limited entry, guaranteed margins. Consumers with no leverage. But there's still one layer left, because all of these monopolist food, telecom, banking, airlines, dairy depend on something else to function. They depend on movement of goods, and that movement is controlled by just to steel arteries running across the country. And when those arteries stop, the entire nation feels it. The iron arteries when the country runs on two tracks. If you've made it this far, you might think, fine, I'll opt out as much as I can. Grow some food, use less data, fly less, spend carefully. But there is one thing you cannot escape. Everything you touch, your groceries, your furniture, your fuel, your building materials, the fertilizer that grows your food had to move. And in Canada, almost all of that movement runs on two steel spines. Canadian National CN and Canadian Pacific Kansas City CPKC. Two companies, one country. That's not a metaphor. That's geography. Canada is too large for trucks to handle bulk freight efficiently over long distances. Ships work on coasts, not interiors. Pipelines are politically radioactive, which leaves rail. And rail in Canada is a duopoly. Together, CN and CPKC control the vast majority of rail freight capacity. But more importantly, they control who has a choice. If your factory, elevator, mine, or mill sits next to one rail line, you are captive to it. You don't negotiate rates, you accept them. Economists call this the captive shipper problem. Everyone else calls it extortion with timetables. And like every monopoly we've discussed so far, the railways don't need to behave badly to exercise power. The network does it for them. Because once infrastructure becomes essential, regulation becomes timid. Here's the paradox. CN and CPKC are private, profit-maximizing corporations, but they function like public utilities. They control right-of-way access, scheduling priority, terminal capacity, and bottlenecks that no competitor can realistically duplicate. Yet, unlike utilities, they are not regulated to guarantee low prices or universal service. Why? Because governments are terrified of breaking the machine, and in August 2024, Canadians briefly saw why. For the first time in modern history, both railways shut down simultaneously during unresolved labor disputes. The effect was immediate and frightening. Grain stopped moving. Auto plants prepared to shut down. Energy exports stalled. Chlorine shipments for water treatment were delayed. The economy didn't slow. It choked. Industry analysts estimated hundreds of millions in economic damage per day. And that number wasn't politics, it was math. Because rail is embedded invisibly into everything. You never receive a bill from CN or CPKC, but you pay them anyway. When freight rates rise, your groceries cost more. Your car costs more. Your home renovation costs more. Your energy bill rises. Rail pricing is inflation with steel wheels. And because there are only two players, there is no meaningful price discipline. They don't need to collude. Geography colludes for them. They are efficient. They are optimized. They are ruthlessly profitable. And every efficiency gain flows upward to shareholders, not to consumers. At this point, the pattern is impossible to ignore. Food, telecom, banking, air travel, dairy, rail, different sectors, same architecture. But there's still one final layer that makes all of this sustainable. Because monopolies don't survive on economics alone, They survive on narratives. They survive when nobody connects the dots. Which brings us to the monopoly that doesn't charge you directly, but quietly shapes what you think is normal. The media blob. When information becomes a choke point, if money is power, information is the instruction manual. And in Canada, that manual is increasingly written by fewer hands than people realize. Pick up a newspaper in almost any major city. Different names, different logos, different cities. But peel back the masthead. You'll see the same fingerprints again and again. One company dominates English-language daily newspapers across vast parts of the country. Local news, national commentary, editorials consolidated into a single corporate pipeline. This isn't diversity, it's saturation. And here's the uncomfortable part. This media empire is not controlled by some civic-minded publisher with a long-term democratic mission. A majority stake is held by a hedge fund based outside Canadian entity whose business model is not journalism, it's asset extraction. The playbook is brutally efficient. Buy struggling newspapers cheaply. Cut experienced reporters and editors. Centralize content. Sell the real estate. Run the newsroom on fumes. The result looks like journalism, but behaves like a content shell. Local reporting withers. City councils stop being watched. Developers stop being challenged. Regional corruption stops being noticed, not because it vanished, but because the watchdog was laid off. And something subtler happens too. Editorial lines converge. The same framing, same narratives, the same common sense. What looks like national consensus is often just copy-paste repetition across dozens of mastheads. This is not about left or right. It's about concentration. When information becomes centralized, public debate narrows. And when debate narrows, systems don't need to justify themselves. They just need to persist. And that's how monopolies become invisible. But the final case, the one that ties everything together, isn't just a company. It's an entire region. A place where corporate power doesn't influence policy. It is policy. And once you see it, you realize this isn't just a story about monopolies. It's a story about how concentration hardens into governance. The company province. When a corporation becomes the state. To understand where all of this leads, you have to leave the big cities. You have to go east. Welcome to New Brunswick, sometimes called, quietly and without irony, Irving country. If the monopolies we've talked about so far are powerful corporations operating inside Canada, the Irving Group is something else entirely. It is a vertically integrated economic ecosystem that functions like a parallel government. One family. One province. Nearly every artery. The Irving Empire spans oil refining, forestry, construction, transportation. Shipping, shipbuilding, retail, logistics, ports, and landowners shed millions of acres of it. Their refinery in St. John is the largest in the country. Their shipyard builds warships for the Canadian Navy under multi-decade federal contracts worth tens of billions. And unlike the banks or railways, Irving is entirely privately held. No shareholders, no quarterly earnings calls. No disclosure requirements. They don't have to tell the public how much they make, how much tax they pay, or how profits move. This isn't just size. It's opacity plus indispensability. In New Brunswick, Irving companies are among the largest employers, investors, advertisers, and infrastructure users. Their payrolls shape housing markets. Their contracts determine which towns grow and which fade. Their supply chains determine who gets access and who waits. And for years, they also owned every English-language daily newspaper in the province, till they sold those papers to Post Media, effectively swapping one monopoly for another. That wasn't an exit. It was risk management. There's a local saying, you either work for Irving, sell to Irving, or depend on someone who does. That's not rhetoric. That's economic geography. When a single corporate group becomes structurally indispensable, democracy doesn't collapse dramatically, it bends. Policy stops asking what's best for the public and starts asking what the system can tolerate. Regulation becomes negotiation. Oversight becomes accommodation. This is the endgame of concentration. Not high prices, those are just symptoms. The real outcome is control without exit. And once exit disappears, choice becomes theoretical. This isn't a Canadian problem. It's a Canadian design. Here's the hardest truth in this entire story. This is not a failure of capitalism. This is what capitalism becomes when concentration is protected, normalized, and politically insulated. Canada didn't accidentally stumble into this system. It built it layer by layer. Foreign ownership restrictions, licensing barriers, quota systems, regulatory complexity, national champion logic. Each policy made sense in isolation. Together, they formed a moat. And once the moat was deep enough, competition stopped trying to cross. Other cold, sparsely populated countries manage competition. Other developed nations allow market entry. Other economies break monopolies before they harden. Canada didn't choose efficiency. It chose comfort for incumbents. And incumbents don't innovate. They extract. Why nothing changes? People often ask, why doesn't the government fix this? Because structurally, it's safer not to. Breaking monopolies risks job losses, risks campaign backlash, risks regional collapse, risks political blame. Raising prices quietly is less visible than closing plants loudly. So regulators become cautious. Politicians become incremental. Consumers become exhausted. And the wheel keeps turning. Fees creep upward. Service quality erodes. Profits compound. Every year, quietly. What can you actually do? You can't boycott food. You can't boycott banking. You can't opt out of rail freight or airport fees. But you can stop accepting the lie that this is normal. You can stop being loyal to brands that treat you as a captive. You can switch flanker plans when they save you money. You can support independent grocers where they still exist. You can subscribe to independent media that isn't owned by a hedge fund. And most importantly, you can stop calling this just expensive. Canada isn't expensive by accident. It's expensive by design. Designed by policy. Protected by regulation. Maintained by silence. The real takeaway: markets don't fail because companies get big. They fail when companies get big and protected. That's when capitalism stops being dynamic and starts behaving like feudalism with better branding and nicer fonts. From the food you eat, to the phone in your hand, to the money in your bank, to the rails beneath your goods. Canada has quietly replaced competition with permanence. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. So tell me, what hits you hardest? The grocery bill, the phone plan, the bank fees, the airline ticket that costs more than the vacation. Drop it in the comments and subscribe. It's the only thing in this entire story that isn't owned by a monopoly. I'll see you in the next one.